Good morning, good evening, good day, wherever you are. Welcome to our fourth workshop, which is related to our Oxford University Press book on technology upgrading in emerging economies. We had several very successful workshops. The last one will be in April. And in each of the workshops, we discuss one section of the book, one thematic topic in the book, and the last thematic issue is this issue of innovation policy for technology upgrading. For those that do not know me, I'm Slavo Radosevic. I'm here at UCL, Professor of Innovation Studies. I'm here because I'm one of the five co-editors of this volume, together with Xudong Li from Seoul National University, Kun Lee, who is also now with us, also from Seoul National University, Dirk Meissner from Higher School of Economics from Moscow, and Nick Van Ortas, who is unfortunately unable to be today with us, who has several hats. Two are for sure, George Washington University and University of Campinas, which is the organizer of this event. We have excellent support from Guilherme de Silva, who is here in the background. If there are any technical problem, I hope we'll have some solutions. So that's for introduction. We have three excellent speakers, as the book will be coming out in June, and we will also have, after some time, open access, because the topic of that book is such that really it has to be widely available. On today's session, we are addressing three issues which are nicely complementing each other. First one is the example of very successful policy in China of using large-scale programs to help develop technological capability. So from China, we have Xudong, who is the professor at the Tsinghua University. He's engaged in a numerous project in this area. So man, which is kind of really has his hands on a variety of projects related to companies, to also policy practice in China. So he will be talking first. Second speaker will be Carlo Pietrobelli, who will be talking about the industrial innovation policies in the world of global value chains, because today any industrial policy has to consider the role of global value chains. If you could notice the literature today, which tries to link innovation system with the global value chains, global value chain oriented policies, and so on and so on. And Carlo Pietrobelli is one of the leading kind of contributors in that area in the world. He's a professor at the University of Rome, Roma 3. He was involved in the past also in the policy work with the Inter-American Development Bank. He's also attached to UNU-MERIT, to Georgetown University. So really a competent person to give us an overview of that issue of chain and industrial policy. And then we have as a third speaker, Yevgeny Kuznetsov, who I know for a number of years. He's currently senior research fellow at the World Bank Migration Policy Institute. He's for a number of years consultant of the World Bank, working on different world regions, very much active in Latin America, and man with really hands-on understanding with the know-how of the policy issues. And you will notice also a man with the quite distinctive views on the industrial policies. Why? Because he's very much engaged also in the implementation side. And so this will be a account which is not entirely kind of overcomes all the deficiencies of only kind of, let me put it, academic view on that. And then we have a privilege to have discussants, and today we have two discussants, not only one. And there are two because I came across a paper from the IMF, you wouldn't believe, whose title is "The Return of the Policy That Shall Not Be Named." I look at it, what is that? Subtitle is Principles of Industrial Policy. And I was, taken completely by surprise that something like that. So let me put it, heterodox and very analytical, excellent, comes out of IMF. And here we have two excellent contributors, Fuad Kassanov, who is a senior economist at the IMF and also professor of economics at Georgetown, Washington University, and Reda Sharif, who is also senior economist. And they both worked on the different issues in development economics. And it seems that their recent interest is in this area of industrial policy. And I really strongly urge you to look at that paper and see this valuable contribution. And I'm really looking forward to hear from them today. So this is all in terms of introduction, who are the speakers. The idea is that speakers will be talking first for 15 minutes maximum each. And then we will have a really open discussion. In the past, that was the most interesting part of it, where you can either type in the comments, or if you are directly in Zoom, you can raise your hand. So the idea is that really this goes very informally and in very kind of with intensive interaction, so that we really all learn and spend interesting 2 hours. So without further ado, let me introduce, let's start with the first presentation by Professor Gao Xudong. And I hope he can share his screen. He will be talking about his large-scale programs in China, and which is obviously, it seems, success story. So let's see what the rest of the world can learn from that experience. Of course, it doesn't mean that everything is transferable from China, but I'm sure that there will be interesting lessons for the rest of us. Gao, yeah, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Slavo. Hello, everyone. Good day. Let me get started. Sharing screen. So Slavo, I hope you and the colleagues can, see the,
yeah, we can see. Point. Absolutely fine.
Thank you very much. Okay, I will, finish, within 15 minutes. So the topic is using large-scale programs to help develop technological capabilities. We have some cases. This is the agenda: the phenomena, the research question, literature, research methodology, key findings, and some discussion. The phenomena is like this. I'm sorry, let me move, this so that you can see it. Yeah, okay. So the phenomena is, in some areas, in several sectors, China has been very successful in developing its technological innovation capabilities. Here's the sectors are what I mean. In telecom, including telecom equipment and also telecom service, especially in 4G and 5G. China has been leading the world for many years. In ICT sector, including the internet companies, some of them are also making very big, progress. In ultra high voltage transmission system, led by the state grid, China is #1 in this area. High speed rail, very similar. In aerospace, China, I think, is still behind the US, but is making very quick catch up. So here is just some pictures. High speed rail, for example, even in 2017, China accounted for 60% of a high-speed rail in the world. Last year, 2020, we have more than 33,000 kilometers high-speed rail under operation. I think that's more than 60%. This is the aerospace industry. Then the question is why a developing country could make such rapid progress in these high-tech company sectors. So the research question is the following three: how the 8 large-scale programs were initiated. So our observation is, these large-scale programs are really important. So we selected 8 of them. And what strategies did the stakeholders use in execute these 8 programs? And what theoretical and practical insights we can draw from these programs? We look at the literature, especially 3 streams of them are very helpful. The first one is about COPS, complex product, because they are different from consumer goods. And the second one is about large-scale systems, because this kind of technical systems involves a lot of risks and high commitment is needed. The third one is about strategies and challenges for developing countries' development of large technical skills and adoption of COPS. Usually, in these sectors, multinational companies are the dominant players. How local companies, as latecomers, can deal with the challenge. So the methodology is a case study method, but it's not about one case. As I mentioned earlier, it's 8 projects selected from 3 studies. One is about 3G, another one is about innovation in state-owned enterprises, and the third one is about user-driven innovation, especially in big systems. We interviewed more than 140 people. Actually, after we started writing the paper, not the paper, writing the chapter, we interviewed more people. So the key findings include the following. The first one is about strategic intent. Initiation of these large-scale programs are based on strategic intent, especially changing the existing user-producer relationship, as suggested by Professor Longwell. The key point is you have to rely less on multinational companies, but more on local companies. I will explain why this is the case. The second finding is, different strategies are used to build up the new user-producer relationship. And we also find the third finding, very complicated impact of government and also social environment, government policy and social environment. Usually people think Chinese government are very supportive, but in fact, it's not. In some cases, very supportive. In some cases, they do not provide much support. The last one is, the crucial rule of outstanding leaders. I will give, specific examples of that. So this is a figure to illustrate, the relationships among, different factors affecting the large-scale program development. Let me look at the first finding, initiation. We find actually 3 types of initiators. The first one is big users. For example, Shenzhen Metro, Shenzhen Subway, this company, they find the equipment, the systems they bought from multinational companies is so expensive. They just could not afford it. In 1995, for 1 kilometer subway line, the cost is 600 to 800 million RMB. So that's huge money. So the company just said, we want to develop the subway. However, we just could not, pay so high price. This is why they began to, develop, actually help local companies to develop subway equipment. This is for users. Producers can also initiate the large-scale program. The telecom equipment sector is an example. The third one is government agencies. They can also initiate this kind of large-scale program. Strategies is a three kind of strategies. Let me just mention one of them. The first one, if the central government agency is a key initiator, technology transfer from multinational companies actually is relatively easy because they want to work with the Chinese central government. The market is so big, so very attractive. Here, the strategy is how to leverage the huge huge local market to transfer technology. The impact of government policies and the social environment, as I mentioned earlier, I think I don't want to repeat, but it's not like the society, the government always support local innovation. No, actually, in some cases, especially, for example, in telecom equipment, in 3G, the key service providers, none of them want to adopt the locally developed technological system. The government, the policy is very ambiguous. In some cases, in some time, they are supportive, but in many cases, not. Finally, for some reason, they said, okay, we want to support. So that's why 3G become successful. And then that led to the development of 4G and 5G. Here, I really want to emphasize the crucial role of outstanding leaders. As I mentioned, from the literature, we can know large-scale technical systems are very different from other projects. They are very risky, need a lot of investment, a lot of uncertainty, takes a long time. So how can we manage this kind of programs successfully? Is very challenging. But one example, as I mentioned earlier, is the Shenzhen subway. One gentleman called Jian Lian, the second point, Mr. Jian Lian, he's a vice president in charge of not only procurement, but also operation. He stayed in that position for almost 20 years. That actually that assured the success of this project. In other cases, we find a similar kind of pattern. We also noticed if the tenure for the key person is not long enough, the program can't be successful. Here, I think I want to skip, but I want to mention one thing. In the development of these large-scale, programs, one major challenge is the so-called latecomer disadvantage. Means local people, including government agencies, local users, local companies, do not buy from locally made innovations. So I think this is a very big challenge. To manage these 8 programs, manage latecomer disadvantage is a big challenge. And that actually decided whether or not the program will be successful. So the discussion part, I think it will be very quick. I started with the research question. What we find is, the findings have some very important, I think, theoretical and practical implications. For example, theoretically, according to the literature, evolution of large technical systems in developed countries, here, actually, let me show. In developed countries, inventor entrepreneurs, financer entrepreneurs, and also the consulting engineers, they play very important role. But in the study about the Chinese cases, we find that is very different. Actually, manager entrepreneurs, they are making crucial decisions. So their role is, their role is the most important one. Of course, I think this have practical implications for local companies and also for multinational companies. For example, for multinational companies, Chinese market is very big. However, if you want to have a big market share, better not to keep your product, your service at an extremely high price. Otherwise, local users will be forced to develop the alternative. So let me stop here. Slavo, I hope I did not use up all the 15 minutes. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlo. Yes, you saved us, well, 2 minutes. Much appreciated.
Okay, also, not good enough.
Yeah. Thanks for giving the really essence of the paper, which is extremely actually interesting read, because there's a lot of kind of real world insights. So I strongly recommend you to read it in its full version when it becomes available. So there are lots of things for others to chew, and we'll leave discussion at the end. So I would thank you very much. So I would like to now give floor to Carlo Pietrobelli, who will be talking about the industrial innovation policy in the world of global value chains. Carlo, I hope you can share your screen now.
Thank you very much, Slavo, and thank you all for being part of this interesting conversation. The paper I'm presenting is essentially based on the work that we produced for the book, but it also includes some steps further that we've been developing after the book was finally approved. And in particular, I would like to focus on GVCs, global value chains, and how they force a necessary rethinking of industrial and innovation policies. The background, the starting point is that GVCs still represent a remarkable share of international trade in spite of recent setbacks, but I'll show you some figures that confirm that GVCs are still a very strong and important reality in the international economy. And secondly, I will argue that there is a lot of evidence that leads us to think that GVCs and their governance and their way of organizing and coordinating activities across countries is intrinsically related to the development of innovation systems. And therefore, taking into account the co-evolution or the mutual interdependencies between GVCs and innovation systems is very important. And that opens the door to my argument that GVC is forced to rethink economic policies. And I propose a little typology and some examples of what I would consider GVC-oriented policies. The first argument is that GVCs are still a very important reality in the international economy. These are data from UNCTAD. There's more recent data that confirm the same evolution. Foreign value added is the share of trade that is made of imported inputs. That's one of the proxies for the presence of value chains in international trade. And you see that over time, at the world level, the orange slice has been increasing over time. So there's been an increasing relevance of value chains over the years. After 2017, it's been a little slowed down, but still at least 1/3 of international trade flows are related to the working of value chains. Yet there is tremendous diversity across countries. Some countries take part very intensively in value chains, others do that at a much lower level. Here I have data on a number of developed and developing countries, and essentially what we can notice here, this is foreign value added, exactly the same indicator I was showing before, over a period of 10 years, and we see that South Korea, for example, has been heavily participating in value chains with an increase and then a decrease. South Africa has constantly been on the increase. China, on the other hand, has been strongly developing domestic value added and reducing the share of international trade explained by imported inputs, gradually substituting these imported inputs with domestic productions. And more advanced countries like European countries or the United States have, as a percentage of exports, they have lower shares, even if within Europe there's a remarkable extent of value chains. But the message of this slide is that there is diversity. The development towards value chains is not shared by everybody and is shared to a different extent by different countries. And if we move to the sectoral level, we discover that this diversity is even more pronounced. Look at, these are data for value chain participation at the world level on 64 countries that have been producing some hardware and some software. This is computer and electronics versus information technology and services. Again, 2005, 2015, and we see that the computer electronics has a larger presence of value chain forms of organization of production, yet it is going down, this share is going down, whereas it is exactly the opposite with information technology services and software, which is going up. Look at the arrows there that show tendencies that have been recorded and that have been confirmed over the last few years. So even within sectors, there are remarkable differences, and across sectors, there are remarkable differences in terms of value chain integration and participation. And that opens the door to my second argument. The first one was value chains, in spite of diversities across sectors and countries, are still a defining feature of the international economy. The second statement I would like to make is that innovation systems are related to value chains, and there is a mutual interdependence that I try to address with some colleagues in a recent paper that is under assessment in a new blog that came out last week. You find the references here, where essentially we combine measures of value chain participation with measures of the strength of the sector innovation system using mainly patents. And what we discover is that the impact, the influence of value chain integration on the development of innovation systems is not one way, it's not unidirectional. And on the other hand, there are remarkable differences across the two sectors we studied, hardware and software, electronics and information services. And you will see from the next slide, we managed to group countries according to different clusters that cluster countries sharing similarities in their innovation systems and extent of participation to global value chains. And we did that for the hardware and the software sector on the left-hand side and the right-hand side of your slide there. And you see that the tendency has been very different. The first main result of this is that there is a remarkable cumulativeness of innovation in information technology sectors. So the countries that started with better innovation and better innovation systems and more patents classified in many different ways continue to be dominating. There is a path dependence or a hysteresis here and a lot of cumulativeness. And secondly, the diagram on the left-hand side shows how in the hardware sector, an increased innovation capacity, which is on the vertical axis, is associated with a decreased GVC integration, which is on the horizontal axis. So the improvement in the innovation, the sector innovation system does not go together with the deepening of value chain integration. In the software sector, on the right-hand side, the evidence appears to show the opposite. Look at the cluster S1 with the blue dots, and you see that countries that have been further deepening their participation to value chains also saw an increase in the sectoral innovation systems. We don't claim to analyze causality here. The data did not allow us to do that, but we are catching different pictures, and what we argue is that the developments of the strength of the innovation system and the integration in value chains in these two sectors has been moving in very different directions and following very different trends. So we concluded that GVCs are still an important feature of the international economy. Secondly, there is a strong connection between value chains and value chain integration and the development of sectoral innovation systems. We know from the literature and from abundant empirical evidence that a well-functioning innovation system is an essential ingredient for a country's pattern of growth. And this forces us to go deeper and try to understand what countries could do in terms of policies and how they would need to rethink their economic policies in light of the emergence and the integration in value chains. And what follows here is not so much reasoning on policies for global value chains. We're not investigating to what extent value chains should be encouraged, but rather we look into the how the different policies that could maximize, that could improve the capacity to benefit from value chains could be shaped and could be implemented. Behind the statement, there's clearly the acknowledgement that integrating into a value chain is not per se sufficient to stimulate growth, but the contribution of value chain integration to growth, productivity, value adding, upgrading is also conditional on a number of different complementary assets and complementary activities and government related policies. The first assessment I would like to make is related to my last sentence. Economic policies and value chain oriented policies need to face different challenges, and there is a major divide between policies to promote integration into value chains, getting access if you're not part of a, or if your enterprises are not part of a value chain, how do you get access? How do you integrate and help integrate your firms into value chains? But there's also a very remarkable dimension, and the two overlap in many instances, and they complement each other, or they can lead to different outcomes, but they're worth analyzing. The same dimension has to do with policies aimed at capturing value, gaining the rents, getting access to the rents that are generated along value chains. And that has to do, for example, with the challenges that firms face whenever they try to enter segments offering the prospect of getting access to higher value added. Getting access to the different segments of the value chain that can lead to an additional and the promotion of learning and innovation that can itself lead to a number of spillovers that will end up having additional effects on the economy and its economic growth. And the development of technological capabilities that are related to a different extent to participation and integration in value chains in different segments of the chain. So the major divide, first getting access and then capturing value, which can take place at the same time, overlap, but they are conceptually different. And to try to explain and to try to present a framework, I will use a simple typology, which has been used in other exercises trying to classify industrial policies or innovation policies, that stresses two dimensions. Stresses the dimension of being horizontal or vertical, I would agree with the argument that if we analyze the issue very specifically, with great attention, I would agree that there's no purely horizontal policy, because all policies sooner or later will end up being also vertical, will also be promoting sectors or promoting niches of economic activity. But for the sake of simplicity, there's a big divide between the horizontal and vertical policies. And the second dimension, the type of intervention, whether policies are related, use instruments such as the provision of public inputs, the provision of the making of public goods or club goods of different kinds, and the market interventions that would lead to different relative prices of products and factors. And the examples you can easily capture from the photographs there are examples of, think of the public inputs provided through the provision of public goods, such as phytosanitary controls for the fruit export business, for example, that consists of a public good made available by the government or through different public-private arrangements to help address a problem that is vertical, that is specific to a sector. Or market interventions such as, for example, a horizontal research and development subsidy. So research and development expenditures would be supported and subsidized whatever the sector of application is. And provided that the investment is in research and development activities, then they would enjoy a subsidy of different kinds from the government. So this is a simple 2x2. Why does this matter? I argue
Carlo, sorry, could you just speed up maybe?
Yes, okay.
Time. Thank you.
Right. This matters because there's different pros and cons in each quadrant. The risk of seeking and capture by individuals is very different according to the different quadrants. And the role of institutions and the feasibility of supporting institutions or creating institutions to promote and implement these policies is also very different in the different quadrants. And I try to use this typology to start thinking in terms of value chain oriented policies and classifying them according to the horizontal, vertical nature or the different instruments they would use. And you can see yourselves from this matrix examples of how, for example, a value chain oriented policy could be vertical, that is focusing on specific sectors and providing public inputs, such as, for example, skills training center related to the sector, or improving the quality system of the country, or strengthening linkages and potential spillovers between local participants and value chain lead firms, and so on. And similarly, if you go to the specific quadrants, you see examples of how value chain policies can take form and can take place in the different countries. 3 examples, very quickly. One is a policy that was implemented in Costa Rica, which I would call a value chain oriented policy. There was a policy to modify the investment attraction policy by targeting specific segments of the medical devices value chain, and considering that there was a missing segment of the chain that was not available in the country, and that used to hinder the development of the whole chain in the country, the investment attraction agency, CINDE, managed to go to the US and attract a specific company in charge of serialization that allowed the value chain to integrate this missing element and overcome this chicken and egg problem that nobody was providing this kind of serialization services. Nobody would provide them unless the rest of the value chain would be working, and therefore the government intervention helped in offering a solution very consistent with the value chain logic. Second example comes from Malaysia, where we all know that as far as value chains are concerned, the role of institutions and organizations in charge of technology provision, dissemination, help with technological support of different kinds, and the different kinds of certifications in place, and the requirements of metrology and laboratory services and so on. Malaysia, the effort has been to create government-sponsored, sometimes public-private, sometimes fully public institutions in charge of supporting firms integrating value chains with advanced testing services at subsidized rates, as well as different kinds of lab exercises related to the specific sectors and specific value chains by providing public goods. Almost finished. Vietnam is another example. This recently approved supporting industry policy framework, still beginning in its very inception phase, but from what I see, from what I could study and understand, it really looks like a value chain oriented policy by helping industries, local industries, supporting their integration in value chains through the provision of different subsidies and the building of different public goods and so on. Takeaways, conclusion. GVCs still matter a lot. They still represent a large share of the organization, the prevailing international organization of production. I could document some traces of a co-evolution between value chains and innovation systems. And I started scratching the surface of what I would call a GVC-oriented policies, trying to sketch a classification and providing you with some examples. There's more work that is coming out in a special issue that we're editing with Roberta Rabelotti and Arif Hanashe, where some of you are also taking part and offering papers. It will be out in July. Some of the papers that already highlight different dimensions of GVC-oriented policies are available in the journal web pages, advanced publications there. And that's that. I can stop here. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Carlo. Thank you very much for giving us a kind of neat picture and several kind of, for me, very interesting insights, which I hope we'll come back to them in the discussion. Because we are slightly behind the schedule, I would like to give floor to Yevgeny, who will be talking about the experimentalist governance for technology upgrading, new industrial policy processes. So something which for maybe some of you will be quite new type of insights. Yevgeny?
Yes, let me start sharing screen. And thank you very much for the invitation to the book and for this workshop. Carlo actually set a stage for me very nicely. So I can just as well start with vertical industrial policy, because we already talked about horizontal, and it's the most controversial. So the question of the chapter is how we can do vertical industrial policy right, so to speak. And I'll start that there is three major problems we are facing when we are doing vertical industrial policy. Is that picking winners in fast-changing industries is very problematic, because winners are continuously evolving. Second, that is capability and information problem of the public sector. A tacit assumption that it has all the information, it does not. And the third one, I would argue, is the most relevant now, both in developed and developing world. It is the capture by vested interest. This is political economy problem. So doing industrial policy invariably faces so-called problem of disentrenchment. So how we are proposed to deal with it? And I'm saying this because this work deals or draws rather on our joint work with my co-author Chuck Sable, and many ideas is really due to him. The key assumption, we have to now admit that no one has a panoramic view of the economy. All views are partial. That means that we have to shift from one-time choice to manage the process of error detection and correction in whatever choice that we make. And sort of a paragon of this is early stage venture capital. It's sort of, I would argue, it's if we are facing private public venture capital, for instance, it's a paragon of industrial policy process done right. And so in a way, there is a paradox. We have to make choices without picking winners. And so how do we, question of the chapter, how can we manage this search process of making choices without picking winners in the public sector, because public sector is involved, and how can we make this process accountable, meaning that if mistakes are made, there is some accountability for them, but the mistakes are still encouraged. This is something very new for the public sector, because we all know mistakes in the public sector are not encouraged. Sometimes they are equated with corruption, that if you made the mistake, there is some interest behind. And what is the incubation cycle of new industrial policy program? How they are conceived, corrected, and terminated, discontinued. So there is this is the questions of the chapter. I'm not going to address all of them in the presentation. My task is just to give you a gist of what the chapter is about. So collaborative search and experimentation we are talking about. There are really two dimensions to it, two sides of the same collaborative process, that agents with new capabilities that the new industrial policy is created, a new private sector which learns to innovate by connecting to the world economy, and a new public sector which is capable of providing complementary public inputs. They are emerging together as the two sides of the same collaborative process. And basically what we see in our experience of the World Bank and the literature, that this process can begin at least if the most of the firms are rent-seeking and the government on the whole rent-seeking. That's a little bit of a paradox, but the issue here is heterogeneity of both public and public sector. The issue is to look at whatever percent of exception we have and start from there. And there are three ingredients to a new industrial policy process, I argue. There is a new generation of programs which institutionalize search and experimentation networks. In the chapter, there are examples of that. It's, for instance, YOSMA in Israel, Supply Development Program in Ireland, VC program in Taiwan, etc., etc., etc. There is a locus of experimentation, what we call a Schumpeterian Development Agency. The agency which is, although in the public sector, it is capable of accountable experimentation. And again, the example which I discussed in the chapter, it's an office of chief scientist in Israel, Foundation Chile, Scottish Enterprise, and usually they emerge on the organizational periphery of the government, meaning that it's not sort of central attention of the government, and for a while at least. And the key question is, for a while, is that it's able to experiment and get away with experimentation. Then usually it scorches attention of the mainstream, and then the problems emerge. There is a number of work now on the so-called politics of partial success, which discuss why paragons in these slides of such as Office of Chief Economist, we all cite chief scientist in Israel, why they lose their sort of innovation spirit and the spirit of experimentation. But that's beyond the preview of the paper. And perhaps the most important is a diagnostic or problem-solving monitoring, a procedure which would allow you to correct and detect errors. And so just one of these procedures I will illustrate in a bit more detail, and I'm already drawing two. And then we're all familiar with accounting monitoring. That's basically you juggle reports, and then you correct mistakes in a hindsight, so to speak. But here the idea is to do a real time monitoring. That's why it's diagnostic or problem solving, because the idea is to set the incentive structure that the participants of the process would have an incentive to reveal their own errors. Why? Because they're learning from it. And some others would also learn from errors, and that's why you kind of shifting gears, you're picking winners in the process, and winners itself are constantly changing. Let me give a real-time example from Argentina. That's a micro-level example from Fundación Pro Arroz. That's a biotech organization, private-public, which is set up in the province of Entre Rios to develop new varieties of rice. It's an interesting example of diagnostic monitoring because it sort of follows venture capital procedures. They have on-site visit of teams and experiment. When the problems surface, they correct them, and most importantly, they also address the problem of so-called living debt. If you have a living debt is in venture capital parlance is a project which is barely successful. You have to kill it, but you don't have much of an incentive to do it because you already invested into it. It's in your own baby, so to speak. In this example of Pro Arroz, they do it as well. They have to close projects which are not failures, because that's fairly easy to close, but which do not show significant promise to continue them. This is an example of disentrenchment. An incentive structure is such that it allows you to do difficult decisions. And the most difficult decisions in industrial policy is to how to kill things, how to close things, because as we all know, inertia, organizational inertia is tremendous, and you have to be very careful not to continue with activities which are no longer, which do not show promise. So I'm drawing to an end of the discussion, and there are a number of paradoxes in the new industrial policy process. In the paper, I developed 7. Here, just a number of them. We are well aware of accountable experimentation in the private sector, and we know that it's pervasive. In a way, all the innovation in the private sector is based on this accountable experimentation. Example is, of course, open innovation, early stage venture capital, Toyota style production, very limited role of public sector in all of this. This is the first paradox. The second, this was not always the case. In the 60s and 70s, if you look carefully, we had a whole generation of this accountable experimentation in industrial policy in small local economies. Israel, Ireland, Taiwan, Finland would be paragon of this. And then it so somehow subsided. One of the reasons I think it's centrality of new public management, which actually says that, look, no, you don't need to do experimentation in the public sector, because then there would be a conflict of interest between funding and implementation, and you can be taken to all the way to court if you give advice on implementation, and if you fund the program at the same time, for instance. And that's not how diagnostic monitoring is performed. You are not running the program, but you are actively engaged in the program. The good news that there is a very heterogeneous bunch of second generation new industrial policies which are emerging. The best example, of course, would be China, but I gave an example of Argentina, which is unlikely place to look for the best practice, because as we all know, Argentina is competing with Russia for the price of being the champion of creative corruption, because it's not just corruption, but it's constantly changing. So innovation goes into recipe. Yet the heterogeneity argument shows that, look, if you look closely enough, you can find episodes and example even in countries like Argentina, Russia, India, and of course Chile. So there is a whole new set of experiences which are coming, which brings me to the second type of conclusion, that new industrial policy process is basically empirical question. Is there capabilities to run it? How can we describe a life cycle of good practice? For instance, how we can describe life cycle of Schumpeterian Development Agency. Just other things in Schumpeterian world, we have to be prepared that Office of Chief Scientist or whatever Schumpeterian Development Agency is not going to be good forever. At some point, there should be a sunset clause. We have to examine empirically so-called best of the worst practice. Good practice in a bad institutional environment, and this is examples of Chile, Argentina, China, etc., etc. And then there could be also heterogeneity in failure. For instance, smart specialization program, which was designed, at least in its intention, as a new industrial policy program, on the whole, again, as experimental program, we can set aside other objectives. It's probably a failure, but within it, you can say that, look, there is a bunch of successful experiences. For instance, Basque Country was running experimental program before, and Basque Country is quite successful within a program which is generally failed. So there is a kind of three empirical question, which I think is quite interesting. So thank you very much for attention, and I'm looking forward to discussion and questions.
Thank you very much, Yevgeny, for first being in time, and second for really giving lots of food for thought, especially like your paradoxes and economic successes. Generally, successes in economics seem to be about resolving paradoxes. So there's a lot of there that I hope we'll have in the discussion coming now. Now we have two discussants, people that have read these chapters, and this will be really IMF view on these issues. So I would like to give floor to Reda Sharif and Fuad Hasanov. We didn't talk exactly how you will, who wants to go first, and what is your kind of division of labor among you two. So please, floor is yours. Who will come first?
I can start, Slavo. No problem.
Okay,
I guess I'll try to speak for less 7-8 minutes, right, and then to leave the floor to Fuad. First, congratulations. This is a, I think, great contribution to you, Conley, and co-editors, and also for particularly for these 3 papers. So let me just take just 1 minute to say that really fits into what we've been working on with Fuad. Basically, we try to give broad principles of what industrial policy should be. And by the way, Slavo, just to say, this is not the view of the IMF, not just to make this clear. This is our own personal views.
I'm joking.
It's okay, exactly the opposite. So I'm just putting the disclaimer, basically. But basically, the principles we came to, or our conclusion in terms of broad principles, that there is a need for state intervention to move resources into more sophisticated, sectors. There is a need to emphasize domestic and local capabilities. And how do you do that? You have to focus on export orientation, and you need accountability and competition, right? So you need the institution to do that. Now, the questions we usually receive is, how do you do this in practice? And these 3 papers tackle different aspects of this how-to, right? How do you do it, right, to make sure that, the institution actually are capable of, stopping or detecting mistakes? How do they do to, continuously learn? And also, in what sector should you go to, knowing that definition of a broad sector is really not enough? Sectors are actually value chains, and then where do you go in the value chain, right? So each paper really tackled different issues. But now let me just first try to kind of emphasize some of the points that were in the papers, but perhaps didn't come up in the presentations. And I hope really people who are listening will read all the papers, because there are a lot of really striking information. So, for example, in Gao's paper, one striking thing is that, especially in the case of the metro of Shenzhen, is that the leader, right, or the person who's initiating the project, right, was kind of at the border between kind of private and public, between a technological institution but also as a kind of this user, right? So I think Jianlin is the name, right? Gao, correct me please if I'm wrong, but this person basically was, you can say, broadly between the private and the public sector. So that takes me to a broad point, which is when we discuss these vertical policies, right? Coming back to Yevgeny's presentation, one of the main differences between people who are for or against these vertical policies is that they assume that the public sector does not have technical capabilities. However, these technical capabilities, first, very often they're there, but also they're acquired. And then even more important, as Yevgeny mentioned, is that this is an endogenous process, right? There's learning by doing even within the public sector, right? So this is an important point. The second point is that in many cases, the lines are blurred between public and private. So you can see it very clearly in the case of Japan, right? Which had this system of amakudari, which is descent from heaven. So civil servants will work in MITI until they're 55 and then retire and then lead some of the private sector companies, right? So you see that. So you have this also kind of this double sensitivity. So there are a lot of examples. I think you can even see it in the US up to the 50s and 60s when people at Bell Lab, right? This big research, institution actually had also these double hats between private and public. So this is very important. The same thing you see in the experience of the the Taiwanese experience with electronics, right? People at ITRI, this is the umbrella institution that kind of drove the effort to spin off companies in electronic, also would have people who worked for a quasi-public institution and then move right into the private sector. So again, you have these lines blurred. So now to come back to the JVCs. So in a sense, when authorities try to be strategic where to go, I guess it's also important to know where do you go within the value chain, right? So when you look at data on export sophistication, what you see is that, for example, some countries may look like they're extremely sophisticated in their exports. I guess Malaysia and Vietnam are two good examples. But then when you dig deeper and then look at the data that Carlo showed us, right, you realize that, well, actually a lot of the value added is kind of imported, right? So important elements are coming from other countries. And you see some example of countries that were extremely strategic. So they went into the niches or the segments of the value chain where you had kind of the biggest strength or monopolistic rents, right? So I guess semiconductor is an example within the value chain of consumer electronics, but there are other examples. I think Professor Nolan from Cambridge was explaining how, in some big value chains, you had some elements where you have really the oligopolistic competition. I think he mentioned, it was a funny example, is that for aircraft industry, like I think there were perhaps one or two producer of toilets for planes, right? And they would provide these for both Airbus and Boeing. So really where you are is very important, right? So now, so let me finish also, I don't want to take all the time, but let me finish with a few kind of questions. No, they're pretty open, but first in terms of monitoring, right? I think one big issue that's missing, or at least should be kind of developed, is the need for non-market signals early on, right? When you start thinking about success, right, that's the kind of the big issue of, when you look at, early, or I'd say early stages, is that you don't have market signals and you have to give time for these new companies, right, to develop themselves. So what kind of signals do you look at? I think Yevgeny touched on some of them, at least in the paper, but how do you do this systematically? It's pretty difficult in my view. And then the second one is, at what frequency do you monitor, right? If you go to an extreme, it's too high frequency. For a small firm, there's a cost, right? There's a cost of, reporting, there's cost of monitoring. So I guess these are all, as we described with Fuad in the paper, this is all uncharted territory, So there is, as Yevgeny mentioned, this kind of learning also. Now, in terms of JVCs, I guess the question I have is more, can we link Carlo's work with what Gao showed us, no? So what Gao showed us is that you have these big systems of this complicated product, right? They're extremely difficult to do. And I guess a big country with a big population can take the risk to enter in these projects. But can we think about regional cooperation to try to do it together? Because I think one main contribution of Gao's work is to show us that in these complicated products, actually government made savings. So this has a fiscal, it's a quite striking result, right? That that cities actually made savings by having their own, suppliers for these metros, right? So for developing countries, that's very important because maintenance costs are pretty high. But okay, so if you're a small country or a group of small countries, can you actually collaborate, right, to do that together? And finally, like just to finish, I guess now when we think about, okay, so these complicated products, when we think about these institutions that learn, right, and experiment, when you think about the value chain, now can we think also about not just public institution, but also private companies doing this experimentation, right? So I'm thinking about, for example, the role of Samsung in Korea, where you had these big companies that had a lot of suppliers. And there is this anecdote about this Samsung actually sending their own engineers to these smaller suppliers to train them and experiment with them and help them kind kind of evolve. So maybe there's this, we can think also of private companies doing some of these works, including working on these complicated products. So, well, so this is kind of my unorganized ideas. I'll leave the floor to Fuad, right?
Thank you. Thank you, Reda. Well, there are questions for all three presenters, so I hope they've taken them on board. And let's hear now Fuad.
Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot. So I'll continue, I guess, with the thought process, that we had left off. So I think one common theme throughout all these papers was actually very interesting. A lot of kudos to the authors for the papers. Quite interesting to read. One common theme is about the technology and kind of building technological capabilities, right? And especially local firms or homegrown innovation, homegrown technology building. And Rida mentioned also that I think that's what we found in our work too, especially when you look at middle income trap, why countries couldn't escape or kind of moving too slowly in the middle income before they reach advanced country status. It may take decades and decades. And the key element, it's exactly this local technology creation. And I think there are different ways. I think these papers bring together these different ways of how you can go about this, right? So if this is very important of building tech capabilities, homegrown innovation, local technologies, the questions, of course, it evolves around the sectors, right? And Gao's paper mentioned about these huge, large-scale programs, public infrastructure projects, and so on. Carlo's paper mentioned about GVCs, right? So we were thinking about sectors, and there was a discussion in both of these papers about what kind of policies to pursue, not to go into this. And then the third paper by Yevgeny on kind of institutional framework, which institution will drive that process of how you create technologies, of what policies you implement. And this is another important element within this kind of industrial policy, innovation policy. We called it true industrial policy, or kind of, if you examine what it means, it's essentially technology and innovation policy. So it's a kind of the same acronym. So the key element, I guess, is how you combine all these three key components, right, of institutions, sectors, and then, of course, with policies, right? So if I kind of dig deeper into each, just quickly mention a few points. Of course, on the example of China about market for technologies, the question is, how do you do this in other countries, smaller countries, right? Where China, of course, could leverage its market to have technology transfers. For many other countries, it's not going to be feasible. So there is some discussion in the paper about research and development, some support for R&D. And of course, it's one of the major policies that Carlo also has talked about. But the question is, of course, how do you do this, right? This is an important point. Another interesting point about the procurement, right? Gao's paper talked about this, local governments or big firms even, this procurement, creating this procurement helped kind of sustain kind of long-term demand. And the questions of how long, how much should you do this? And I think another element, it comes to also the paper by Yevgeny about failures, right? So Gao mentioned about like aircraft industry. I think some joint ventures in automotive weren't probably as successful. Aircraft still hasn't become successful, but it's still ongoing. So the question is, how do you assess failures? Or as Yevgeny said, when do you pull the plug, right? When do you discontinue projects? And that's, it's also, I think it's still not clear from the papers what you do at the end of the day. How do you decide? And I guess how long you let the projects continue? Because, in many cases in the past, when you look at successful cases, took decades, right? Toyotas and Nokias were profitable like decades later. And the question is, of course, what is the yardstick of performance, right? And how do you help if there is progress, right? Or if there is no progress, how do you help to make sure that there is progress? So I think it's still an open question. One interesting example that Carlo brought up in his paper is about Costa Rica and medical devices, which is interesting because Intel left Costa Rica, and I think it's just only R&D facility there now. But medical devices kind of replaced that hole, that the gap in the production, manufacturing, and of course the exports of the country. But it was mostly about multinationals at the end of the day. So Costa Rica, of course, is a small open economy, but the question is, I'm sure there are local companies there too, but it's to a large extent, these are large multinationals, similar to essentially what Intel was doing earlier in electronics. How do you get local firms to engage with these multinationals, especially since they're already here in your country? And so how do you engage with them and become a part of their value chain to improve this homegrown innovation, technology, and so on? So I guess there is this connection, right? So being part of GVCs is not about FDI and multinationals, but also about this homegrown technologies and connection. And I guess, let me kind of maybe conclude. At the end of the day, it's all about, of course, trial and error, experimentation. So in that sense, I agree completely with Yevgeny. And I think Mariana Mazzucato has been also talking about this in her latest book. It's not about picking winners. It's really about, essentially providing this support to the whole, kind of this entrepreneurial or venture capital type of approach to support to the whole industry of some sort, or missions, right? And one interesting component to all these three papers was about these leaders. The issue of leaders came up that, and I think Yevgeny cited one case study on Russia when there was this charismatic leader. They were doing quite many things, and once he left and became a minister, this whole group that he was pushing forward in terms of science and so on kind of became kind of dormant. So the question is it really about leaders per se, maybe to kind of spearhead or to jumpstart the whole project? But then you need these processes, right? Institutional processes for continuity purposes. And that's another important thing. How do you create that so that it's continuous and doesn't depend on kind of charisma of any particular leader, right? And how do we start this Schumpeterian development agency institutions, right, and make them sustainable, right, rather than creating these Weberian bureaucracies, as Yevgeny mentioned in his paper. Right, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fuad. I think presenters cannot complain that the discussant didn't read carefully their chapters. So that's really quite nice, because very often discussants just carry on, presenting their own work and ignore what we have done. So this is really very much appreciated and refreshing. Before I give floor to discussant, I would like still to pick up three questions. Actually, we have already Sergio's Alice, who would like to make a question, and then we have also in the chat we have few more questions. But let's give opportunity for Sergio, and then we'll give to discussants opportunity to speakers to respond to the questions posed by discussant and by Sergio. Sergio.
Thank you, Slavo. Good morning from Brazil for everyone. Thank you for this excellent presentations, for the three presentators. It's just one thing about, I'm trying to gather all the three presentations in one question. I put the question in the chat. It's more or less the following. The problem of getting in global value chain for a less developed country, as it is our case in Brazil, for instance, the catching up discussion is an endless discussion for many countries, and it is the case here in Brazil. And I was wondering, listening to you, that the million-dollar question that used to be, what are the links in which we have to go into in the global value chain in order to take part in this global value chain? And the following question is how to appropriate more value in these links. This million-dollar question now, I think, moves to another another question, which is, besides having to identify these links in the global value chain, is where to fit in, we also have to ask how to implement it. I mean, this is much more, wouldn't it, much more a thing of an issue of the science of implementation? I mean, wouldn't it be much more a thing of designing how to implement and how to monitor in a long-term perspective, whatever be the links or the parts or the slots in the global value chains you want to be in? Otherwise, I think we have tried to do this many times in many sectors. This is not only a question of a sectorial, a vertical or horizontal policy. It's much more a question of designing and, what the last presentation said, monitoring the implementation and having a kind of durable and permanent care over the policies that are being implemented. So this is, looking at the past here in Brazil, the many different policies that we try to implement in order to develop some sectors, or even for horizontal policies, we have testified that the problem, the central problem for us is that we do not monitor, we do not adjust, we do not make any kind of corrections of path during the implementation of such a policy. So I wonder how to, it's not only a thing of how to identify, how to access, but also how to appropriate value in an increasing way. And this is much more a question, I repeat this, of having a capacity for implementation. And that's why I'm suggesting here that this discussion of catching up has to incorporate more and more the science of implementation. This is my comment. Thank you, Slava.
Thank you. Thank you, Sergio. I suggest now, before we go to the second round of questions we have from Christoph, I would ask now all speakers if you would like to address questions, points raised by Reda, Fuad, and now also the points by Sergio. I don't know if you want to go in reverse order or the same order. It's up to you. Gal, would you want to start first?
Yeah, I think Carlo will be better because that concept is developed by him. But yeah, let me say a few words. I first thank all the two actually commentators. It's great actually. I learned a lot. Also the question about access and benefit from GVC. I really like the idea of regional, collaboration, because for developing countries, a key challenge is we do not have much resources. We do not have much capabilities. So this reminds me actually Professor Michael Porter's work. So innovation is a process. It doesn't matter if you start from a low point, but if you can continuously to innovate, the results will be good. So in that sense, I think, even small countries, smaller countries can collaborate to do innovation in big project. So that also provide a way for the access and the benefit from the global value chain issue. So let me stop here, very brief.
Thank you very much. That was exactly, my question was to you also, because of the Chinese large market, how, is that transferable? But this idea on the regional collaboration is a very nice answer to that. Carlo, would you like to address questions on your part?
Sure. Thank you very much for all these interesting questions and comments. I mean, it's really hard to choose where to start from, because most of the questions were very, very interesting. And if I were to summarize it all, I would say that I would agree with many of the questions, and I think that they stress very relevant issues. And let me quickly go over some of the concepts that I share very much. Fuad was somehow hinting at I would translate this as a micro foundation of industrial policy, or really understanding the details of technological capability development at the firm level and shaping industrial policy accordingly. And that's something I totally share. I think it is very important. And this also links up nicely with what Sergio was suggesting. I would agree that the key issue is not deciding which links to attack and which segments try to get into, and which value chain lead firm lure with incentives to induce them to locate in your or do business with companies in your country. It is probably more an issue of developing local capabilities and strengthening domestic institutions as well as firms and government agencies, so that they then can get access or appropriate of the valuable segments of the value chain. But the little piece of evidence that I was showing before on the hardware and software, the electronics and software sectors, that would hint at a sudden separation of GVC development, GVC integration, and innovation systems deepening, which would suggest that value chains can offer opportunities, but the autonomous effort of developing capabilities and developing institutions and strengthening your own country's firms and institutions is essential in whatever circumstances. And I would argue that what makes a difference is that in a world of value chains, this should be consistent with the shape that the world is taking, the shape of the international transactions and the international collaborations are taking. But the focus on strengthening your capacities, regardless value chains or regardless what happens outside, but really investing in the strengthening of your local firms is very important. And that needs to be micro-founded, that is understood deeply in its microeconomic explanations and mechanisms. I wonder whether the word science of implementation that Sergio was proposing is the right one. Listening to Yevgeny and Gal, I think this is also a matter of clever practice, or like cooking, that you can have a recipe, but then if you don't have all the tacit knowledge and and the capacity to flexibly adapt to circumstances and convince and convene and interact. So that would make it a bit different and far from natural science. I mean, there's a lot of something that is there implicit and tacit that is required to implement carefully whatever kind of policies. And I would agree that if I were to strike a balance, I would say that the focus should be on the implementation, on the how. We can discuss and more or less we all know what should be done, but then how to do it in all the issues you mentioned, the value chains and regional cooperation. That's a wonderful idea, but how do you do it? And sometimes it was generated as an autonomous investment or decision of multinational corporations or governments or trade collaborations or trade agreements of different kinds. But it is really hard. I mean, this is something that's been spoken of in many parts of the world, but then the how is again very, very important. And with all the issues that Yevgeny mentioned, that most of them I agree very much. But again, it's really a matter. It's a little bit of a magic, a little bit of the practice and the details and understanding and considering the context and the circumstances, which make it very hard to develop policy-making skills. But that's something that needs to be developed. I'll stop here. I would have many more, but
thank you. At least now we legitimize something which you can call science of implementation. So let's not throw it out of the table. Let's keep it on the table. Yevgeny, you've got a lot of questions on your part here.
Well, most questions to me were open-ended. So I will only, I think, at this round of answers would focus just on one procedure, which everyone mentioned is in their comments, is monitoring. And the issue I would like to emphasize that it's really about getting an incentive structure which allows to generate knowledge in the process of monitoring. It's not like you are choosing the indicators and then deciding on the point and then somehow producing a graph. At certain point there is inflection point and you decide to stop there. There is a process in which by magic, if you wish to quote Carlo, the decision arises. But then the trust to develop such structure where you would be willing to show your own errors and the motivation for that develop gradually. It's a process of time. Let me give an illustration what I have in mind. In one of the talks I was invited to give in this smart specialization program was actually in Barcelona, which is a fairly good example. It's quite a developed environment with private sector people who told me openly that one condition for the talk, for their discussion, is that no public sector people are present. Because if just anyone is present, we will just obfuscate everything. We would have any motivation to share our own errors. They wouldn't understand. And that's Barcelona, which is fairly developed environment. So that just shows you where most such settings are starting. Because again, venture capital firms use almost no indicators. It's all the setup which actually provides the motivation to share your own errors because you learn from them, and everyone learns from them. And that magic of mutual learning develops very, very, very gradually. It takes time to develop this trust, but the example from Argentina and Russia and India show it can be done. Then the question in which segment it can be done and how it can be scaled up. That I think is the key question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Yevgeny. I suggest that you try to address two questions which are in the chat by Krzysztof Shigelski. I can read them for people that are on YouTube. Question one to Professor Pietrobelli. Is there a case for giving the GVC-related innovation policy a priority over the regular STI policy? Given why? Because given the limited capabilities and resources of the public sector in the developing, catching up countries, so do you prioritize then the GVC compared to your regular kind of? Second question is also for Carlo and for Yevgeny. There doesn't seem to be any irregularity when it comes to success stories of new industrial policy. Do we know anything about the organizational structures that seem to be more successful than others? For instance, in terms of scale or the place in the public sector and political system. So any kind of, generalization or lessons on that part. Do you want to address these two questions now? And then we have this is a question, also a comment from Joanna Castelli from National Technical University of Athens. Industrial policy becomes particularly relevant when thinking the amount of resources to be invested for green transition. The question is whether we could go ahead curbing climate change without some vertical type of policy to boost sector transformation and without the public sector with capabilities to monitor, assess, and design really coordinated measure. If you also want to avoid greenwashing, I hope you are familiar with the term greenwashing, pretending that I'm doing something about green and not doing anything. So yeah, I don't know who would like to address this third question, but all three speakers, and I would also invite discussants if they want to add anything here. Who would like to start first from either the discussant or presenters? Maybe, yeah, Carlo, you
I guess I would question one that is directly related to GVC-related innovation policy, and I wouldn't formulate this question in terms of priority. I mean, what I'm arguing is that GVC-related innovation policy is not something different from regular STI policy. What I'm arguing is that regular STI policy needs to take into account the existence of GVC, and therefore a regular has no reason to remain the same it used to be, but it needs to be rethought and reformulated in light of value chains. So say, for example, promoting the development of technological capabilities of firms through different kinds of subsidies or mechanisms to promote innovation investments. But then having that related to the nature of the industrial organization that is prevailing, that oftentimes has to do with value chains. So for example, specific programs related to strengthening technological capability development of local firms engaged or willing to engage in value chains, and somehow combining that or shaping the innovation policy in a way that considers the way business is being done through this value chain mechanism and so on. So it wouldn't be either or, but it would be a matter of rethinking traditional STI policy in light of something important that is happening, that is value chain organization.
Okay, thank you. Yevgeny, any irregularity when it comes to success story, anything about the organizational structure?
Yes, we actually know quite a bit about about these irregularities. First of all, that the risk has to be shared between public and private sector in a new industrial policy program, and the amount of subsidies or in general public sector contribution which you are giving has to be actually quite small. So it wouldn't be so the participant wouldn't be engaged in a rent-seeking competition. For instance, in case of Russia, in this mega project case, the really serious people went for much more sizable programs and much more sizable give outs. So you are leaving out people who are after innovation, not after rent seeking. One example would be how do you promote early stage venture capital fund. It's always private public. You always ask for 50% contribution from the private sector, which you have to find, and the whole art and craft is to set up a structure which would actually give leadership to the private sector, which means that you don't have much of a scope, so to speak, for this new industrial policy program. That means that if you do it right, it's not about disbursing money. For me, as a public sector official in the World Bank, it's always a problem. I have to move money, and the money is not moving very smoothly or fast here. In fact, they're moving slowly because you are growing a new structure, so to speak. So this would be one regularity. Second regularity would be about these agencies. They are always invariably public in purpose, but private in structure. And that's why they usually operate not just on the periphery in the government, but outside formal government structure, so to speak, because you have to give people who are working on it fairly good remuneration because they are competing with private sector. So they're often exclaves in the public sector, meaning the extension of a global knowledge economy in the public sector. But now they're fairly good knowledge how actually to do this public sector exclave. That would be sort of second type of lessons we have learned. And by the way, talking about success is a little bit too ambitious, I would say. Promise would be a better word, because you have some programs that are doing great, but you have having with the same portfolio of programs, you're having programs which are not doing that great. And that's normal, because again, you're living in Schumpeterian world, everything cannot be successful. That's a lesson which is not easy to swallow in the public sector, but that's unfortunately the way, or fortunately the way it is.
But yeah.
And the third regularity is there, again, there has to be some kind of procedure for at which point you discontinue or restructure your project. And in the paper, I give an example how it's done, for instance, in DARPA, how it's done in RPI, in Fundación Chile. It's always different procedures. So there has to be good policemen and bad policemen, so to speak, and they have to be in communication, because a good policeman kills. It's the most hated person or the department in the organization, but it's a function which has to be present. So I would stop at that.
Could I provoke you further on these things? Because one of the conclusions from your presentation and your work with is that these successful agencies come from periphery. But if you're right in this, that these organizations have to be public in purpose or private in structure. But my question is, do we really then assume that, sorry, this can only come from periphery, never from the core, and when it becomes a core, then it will be killed? So then you all the time have this vicious cycle. Why maybe this is too pessimistic? If I think about the successful FDI agencies in some countries, and let's say I'm familiar with with the Czech Invest, which is doing exactly that, public in purpose, private in the way they operate, and very successful in integrating foreign companies into local value chains. And my question is it really impossible to think about the organization of public sectors, not whole public sector, but segments of public sector on a much larger scale, which would operate on similar principles? Is it just kind of lack of imagination to make this type of reform, which would go then obviously beyond the new public management, and maybe this is something which simply hasn't yet been taken seriously? I mean, does it really always have to be from the periphery and then killed, or is it really situation so pessimistic that it's impossible to think about it that can come within the core of the public sector?
Slavo, I think the promising answer or the encouraging answer that we don't know. That's why I in my last slide I put the research program. It's largely an empirical program. You give an investment of Czech Invest. I can quote a book of Daniel Ornstein, which is called characteristically Good Policies Gone Bad. It's about Finland, Ireland, and all our paragons, which is not very pessimistic account of how good policies, why they go bad. Maybe I'm looking on those examples at the glass which is half empty, which is half full. So I became too much a child of the World Bank itself.
Probably.
Yes. But again, it's an empirical program here for another research question to answer your very good question.
Okay, we have a question from Jana. Jana, do you want to come yourself? I read your question, but I can reinterpret it. But do you want to come directly maybe and ask? It is related to this carbon curbing climate change and whether this can be done by horizontal policies. But you explain yourself, okay?
Okay, thank you for giving me the to talk about that. I just wanted, because I was hearing all these types of measures and the types of industrial policies, and so I was wondering if in the actual recent discussion and what is recently happening with investment for green transition and so on, I think it is very relevant to discuss, first of all, for also vertical policies, and secondly, regarding the presentation of Yevgeny on the public sector and the capabilities of the public sector. I think it is also very relevant to discuss for the capabilities of a public sector that would be able also to monitor, to assess and design measures that are coherent and could be really in the direction of green and assuring green transition, and not only be labeled as green. And this is regarding the capability of the public sector having the technical capability of designing measures that would assure such a transition. So I don't know if what is the opinion.
I'll give floor to speakers and discussant, but my reaction would be immediately, well, any policy has to, in case of greenwashing, there are very capable guys on the other side. So kind of, so you're not talking only about the public sector capabilities, you are talking also the capabilities of the market agents of the companies, how they can always kind of orchestrate or accommodate any kind of rules in which they have to operate, which is
yes.
But okay. I give floors to others. Anybody wants to come on this issue? or it's too difficult? No?
I think Gao is asking.
As he raised the hand, I don't see him. Gao, do you?
Gao is, yeah.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Very brief. I think, you know, the carbon emission is a very big issue all over the world. What I just want to share, you know, what I observed in China. I think, you know, both two kind of forces. One is at the very, you know, top. The central government, actually, President Xi Jinping, he himself is pushing for, you know, reducing carbon emission. And we can see many companies, especially state-owned enterprises, are taking very active, you know, actions to follow what he, you know, he is wishing people to do. On the other hand, we also have actually observations about the bottom-up forces. Some companies actually, for many years, they realized if they can be more environmental friendly, they can benefit from that kind of, you know, practice, not only politically, but more importantly, you know, economically. Their competitive advantage increase because you are adopting new technologies. So I think, you know, I observed two, you know, forces. You know, borrowing from Professor Robert Bogelman from Stanford, I think it's called, you know, the planned innovation and the autonomous innovation. Autonomous here probably is the bottom-up process, and the planned, you know, innovation is guided by the central government. So this is just sharing some information. Thank you.
Thank you. We have 6 minutes, literally. I do discussants wants to come also with a final 1 minute kind of reaction thought.
Yeah, I can
please
start. Yeah, I guess. Yeah.
Yes.
So I guess following up on Joanna's point, you know, I think it's exactly right. You know, the state could find ways to implement industrial policy, especially we already know the technologies are already here. So it's not, you know, there are different angles there where you have to innovate, create new tech, but we already have existing tech like electric vehicles, renewables that need basically much bigger penetration. And of course, without the state, the market will just take too long to do so, and we don't have time, right? So in that sense, you can, and that, you know, fixes huge part of all these carbon emissions. You know, if you almost, I think you go to 80-90% if you just go to transport and renewables industries and so on. It pretty much takes care of most of the carbon emissions, which exactly what you want to do. And another important point, I guess it was also brought up in the chat questions, how do you do it in the environment when you don't have capabilities, especially on the public sector side? And, you know, this goes back to, you know, how do you do it in developing countries, low-income countries, and so on, becomes much harder. But at the same time, it's learning by doing, right? It's the industries and sectors, and of course, public agencies that need to focus on exactly what they're trying to accomplish, which sectors they're trying to revive, support, whether it's GVC, whether it's large-scale program, right, regional cooperation, and then, you know, they're trying to get the right processes in place, experimentation, and so on, as Yevgeny mentioned. And this would, you know, hopefully will start this good cycle of kind of learning by doing and improvement. And that's what East Asia did. No, Koreans did it in the 50s and 60s when they were pretty poor, and they've developed the right agencies. Singaporeans done it in the 60s with Economic Development Board. So, you know, Taiwanese with E3 and so on. So these organizations exist today, and they've been pretty successful you know, for decades. And of course, you know, doesn't mean they will be successful going forward, but they have this process in place.
Thank you very much. Fuad, last, you have 1 minute if you can have your
Sorry, you mean
sorry,
Reda,
sorry.
yeah.
Reda.
I'll be
Sorry.
very quick. I don't have much to add, but I agree with Joanna that basically industrial policies could be the correct framework to think about, fighting climate change. I mean, I could think of it also as kind of a mix of Apollo program, on steroids, plus the issue of diffusion of technologies, as Fuad mentioned, because you want to diffuse it within advanced economies, but also toward also developing economies, and we want to do it fast. So I guess that's maybe one of the questions we have to think about. But then just to conclude, I guess one point I want to make is about the definition of failure, because very often when there is an effort, determined effort to develop capabilities in something sophisticated or actually innovative, it's not a true failure if you take a bit longer kind of time frame, because usually it produces capabilities that applied somewhere, right? So like the SAGE program led to the computer, some suppliers of Petronas in Malaysia became pretty good at engineering for other type of sectors, right? When the oil price fell. So I guess when you go for difficult things, right, there is success, but it might not be where you think. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we've run out of time, so we will have to close here with the 3 final points. One is we have a still comment from Sergio. You can look at it in the chats, but we simply don't have time anymore to address it. First point is I would just like to inform everybody that one of the editors of this volume, Kun Lee, is been appointed also chair of the Government Council of Economic Advisors. So I'm proud to say that finally neo-Schumpeterian economists are becoming influential, and he will be also taking part on an expert meeting of G7 group, which is the highest policy impact that one can imagine. So which means that neo-Schumpeterian economists are now part of the story and carry part of the responsibility. So please take your own research with much more kind of being serious, and this is, you're not anymore in the corner, you are getting into the core. So that's the first thing. Second is that the final workshop of this series will be on 22nd of April. I hope to see most of you at that time, where we'll try to wrap up all the themes. And the final point is Paolo Zamislak, who is professor from University Rio Grande do Sul, is organizing a very interesting event very soon. And Paolo, could you inform the audience about the event?
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. How are you guys? Well, Carlo is here. He will be with us in this event. Kyun also. We are somehow celebrating 30 years of our research group back here in the southern Brazil, NITEC. And we have gathered some friends all around the world to speak a little bit on innovation studies, innovation capabilities, and issues related to that. If you will, Slavo, can I share 10 minutes, 10-second
Guilherme, could you enable him to share?
Screen?
Yeah, I've enabled.
Show you
Okay.
the call.
Me.
Thank you. Well, this is it. Here it is. We call it opening the black box of innovation capabilities. Those are the guys that are invited. This will happen on 13 and 14 April. So in like 2 weeks from here to 3 weeks from here. And get our site, www.nitec.co, like this. And you have the final program, and will be like 4 roundtables, 2 roundtables per day. And I think it will be an amazing opportunity for discuss all those issues that we have doing. I was looking forward to this one. Thank you very much, Slavo.
Thank you, Paolo. Thanks to everybody. Thanks to speakers. Thanks to discussant for really contributing and making it really good learning experience for everybody.